Picture this. You're the smallest person in a room full of future pilots, and everyone treats you like you don't belong. The whispers follow you down every hallway. The smirks greet you at every briefing. Your instructors question whether you have what it takes before you even step into a cockpit. But what they don't know is that while they're sleeping, you're on the mats learning how to fight. Not just any fight, but the kind of fight that teaches you how to stay calm when someone twice your size is trying to crush you. The kind of fight that shows you how to find opportunity in impossible positions. What happens when the same people who doubted your ability to fly a plane suddenly find themselves face to face with you on a jiu-jitsu mat? What happens when the quiet girl they underestimated becomes the person who makes their toughest instructor, a man who's never been beaten, tap out in front of everyone? This is the story of Sarah Chen, a 5'2" aspiring pilot who discovered that sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought in the sky, but on the ground where respect is earned, one submission at a time. Sarah Chen stood at the entrance of Maverick Flight Academy, her small duffel bag feeling heavier than it should. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly as she watched her fellow students gather in clusters, already forming the bonds that would either make or break their aviation careers. At 22, she was younger than most, and at 5 feet 2 inches, she was definitely smaller than all of them. The academy was known for producing some of the finest commercial pilots in the country, but it was also known for something else: its brutal elimination rate. Of the 60 students who started each program, fewer than 20 would graduate. Sarah had worked 3 jobs for 2 years to save enough money for tuition, and she wasn't about to let anyone or anything stand in her way. "You sure you're in the right place, sweetheart?" The voice belonged to Derek Martinez, a former Air Force pilot who carried himself with the swagger of someone who had never been told no. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had the kind of confidence that filled a room. The community college is about 10 miles down the road. Laughter rippled through the group of students nearby. Sarah felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm exactly where I need to be." Derek grinned, but it wasn't friendly. "We'll see about that. Flying isn't like other jobs. You need strength, endurance, and the ability to make split-second decisions under pressure. No offense, but you look like you'd blow away in a strong wind." More laughter. Sarah noticed that not everyone was laughing. A few students looked uncomfortable with Derek's behavior, but no one spoke up. That was her first lesson about flight school. It was every person for themselves. The first few weeks were exactly what Derek had predicted they would be. During physical training, Sarah struggled to keep up with the larger students during strength exercises. When they practiced emergency procedures, her shorter stature made it harder for her to reach certain controls quickly. The instructors, while professional, often used her as an example of how challenging aviation could be for people who didn't fit the traditional pilot mold. "Chen, you're 3 seconds slower on that emergency checklist than Martinez," barked Captain Harrison during a simulation exercise. "In the real world, 3 seconds is the difference between a safe landing and a smoking crater." Sarah bit back her response. She wanted to point out that she had completed the checklist perfectly, while Derek had missed 2 crucial steps. But she was learning that perfection from her was merely acceptable, while mediocrity from Derek was praised as natural talent. The social dynamics were just as challenging as the academic ones. During mealtimes, Sarah often found herself sitting alone while the other students shared stories about their previous flying experience or family connections in aviation. Many of them had grown up around planes, had fathers or grandfathers who were pilots, or had spent years preparing for this moment. Sarah's background was different. Her parents owned a small restaurant in San Francisco's Chinatown, and the closest she had come to flying before this was working extra shifts to pay for a few discovery flights at a local airport. "Where'd you say you were from again?" asked Jessica Williams, one of the few female students in the program, during a particularly awkward lunch conversation. "San Francisco," Sarah replied, hoping the conversation would develop into something more substantial. "Cool. My dad flies for United out of SFO. Captain Williams? Maybe you know him?" Sarah shook her head. "I don't really know any pilots personally." The conversation died there, as it always did. She wasn't part of their world, and they made sure she knew it. The breaking point came during the 4th week. Sarah had been struggling with a particularly complex navigation exercise when Derek, who was seated behind her in the flight simulator, started making comments loud enough for others to hear.
"Maybe if she could reach the controls properly, she'd actually be able to fly this thing," he said, causing snickers from several nearby students.
I heard they're thinking about lowering the physical requirements just so people like her can pass, added Brad Thompson, another student who had taken every opportunity to undermine Sarah since day one.
That's not fair to the rest of us who actually belong here, Derek continued. Some jobs just aren't meant for everyone. Sarah's hands tightened on the flight controls, but she forced herself to continue the exercise. She had learnt early in life that responding to bullies often made things worse, especially when you were outnumbered. But inside, something was building, a determination that went beyond just wanting to prove them wrong. That evening, as she sat in her tiny apartment reviewing flight manuals, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She had noticed a small martial arts gym a few blocks from her apartment building. The sign in the window read, "Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, first class free." She had never done any martial arts before, but something about it appealed to her. Maybe it was the idea of learning to defend herself, or maybe it was the hope that physical training might help her perform better in flight school. The gym was small and smelled like sweat and determination. The walls were covered with photos of tournaments and belt promotions, and there was an energy in the place that was completely different from the sterile environment of flight school. Sarah stood nervously in the doorway, suddenly questioning her decision.
"You here for the free class?" The voice belonged to a woman about Sarah's age, with calloused hands and a warm smile.
I'm Maria Santos, one of the instructors here. Sarah nodded.
I'm Sarah. I've never done anything like this before. Perfect. The best students are the ones who come in with no bad habits to break. Maria handed her a loaner uniform. Fair warning, no. Jiu-Jitsu isn't like other martial arts. It's going to challenge you in ways you never expected. As Sarah changed into the unfamiliar white uniform, she had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. She also didn't know that in 6 months she would use the skills she was about to learn to silence every person who had ever doubted her, starting with Derek Martinez himself. The first class was humbling. Sarah learned basic positions, how to escape when someone was holding her down, and the fundamental principle that would eventually define her approach to everything, leverage and technique, could overcome size and strength. She was terrible at it, of course. She got swept, submitted, and dominated by everyone she trained with, including other beginners. But there was something different about how she felt when she walked out of that gym compared to how she felt leaving flight school each day. At flight school, she was constantly trying to prove she belonged. At the jiu-jitsu gym, she was simply trying to improve. The difference was significant. "How'd it go?" Maria asked as Sarah returned her borrowed uniform. "I got destroyed," Sarah said with a laugh that surprised her. "But I want to come back. That's the only requirement. You show up, you try your best, and you don't quit when things get hard. Everything else is just time and repetition." That night, Sarah lay in bed thinking about the day's events. At flight school, Derek had made another comment about how she was probably just there to fill some kind of diversity quota. At jiu-jitsu, she had learned that a 110-pound woman could control and submit a 200-pound man if she understood leverage and positioning better than he did. For the first time since starting flight school, Sarah smiled before falling asleep. She had found something that belonged to her, something that no one could take away or belittle. She didn't know it yet, but she had also found the key to everything she was trying to achieve. The next morning at flight school, Derek's comments seemed less sharp, Brad's snickers less cutting. Not because they had changed, but because Sarah was beginning to understand that their opinions about her weren't facts. They were just noise. And in jiu-jitsu, she was learning how to stay calm and focused even when someone was trying to overwhelm her with pressure and aggression. As she walked into her morning briefing, Sarah noticed something different about her posture, her breathing, her presence. She was still the smallest person in the room, still the outsider, still the target of whispered doubts and casual dismissals. But something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer just surviving flight school. She was preparing for war. 3 months into her jiu-jitsu training, Sarah was a different person than the one who had first walked into the gym. Her body had adapted to the constant physical challenges, developing a wiry strength that surprised her instructors and training partners alike. More importantly, her mind had adapted to the mental pressures of combat, learning to think clearly even when someone was trying to choke her unconscious. "You're picking this up faster than anyone I've taught," Maria told her after a particularly intense rolling session. Rolling was what jiu-jitsu practitioners called sparring, live combat where both people were trying to submit each other. Most people take 6 months to develop the kind of composure you're showing. Sarah wiped sweat from her forehead and tried to catch her breath. She had just spent 5 minutes grappling with Carlos, a purple belt who outweighed her by 60 pounds. And while she hadn't submitted him, she had prevented him from submitting her, something that would have been impossible when she started. I think it's because I spend my days dealing with people who want me to fail, Sarah said. This feels easy compared to that. Maria raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? For the first time, Sarah opened up about flight school. She told Maria about Derek's constant comments, about the instructors who seemed to expect her to fail, about the isolation she felt every single day. She talked about how she had to work twice as hard as everyone else just to be considered adequate, and how even her successes were dismissed as luck or lowered standards. Sounds like those people need to learn some respect, Maria said quietly. There's a technique for that in Jiu-Jitsu. What's that? You make them tap. The conversation stuck with Sarah as she continued training. She was learning that Jiu-Jitsu wasn't just about physical techniques, it was about mental warfare, about staying calm under pressure, about finding opportunities when others saw only problems. These were exactly the skills she needed to succeed in aviation, but they were also the skills she needed to deal with people like Derek Martinez. At flight school, the academic portion of the program was intensifying. Students were learning complex navigation systems, weather interpretation, and aircraft systems that would make the difference between successful flights and emergency situations. Sarah was excelling in these areas, often scoring higher than anyone else in her class. But the social dynamics remained challenging. Chan's got the book knowledge down, I'll give her that, Captain Harrison said during an instructor meeting that Sarah accidentally overheard. But book knowledge and real-world application are two different things. She's still struggling with the physical demands. Sarah wanted to argue. She wanted to point out that her struggling consisted of being 3 seconds slower than Derek on emergency procedures, while her navigation scores were consistently perfect, and her weather interpretation was better than most of the instructors. But she was learning to pick her battles. The breakthrough came during a particularly challenging simulation exercise. Students were put through a scenario involving multiple system failures during a simulated approach to landing. The exercise was designed to test their ability to prioritize tasks, communicate effectively, and maintain aircraft control under extreme stress. Sarah was paired with Derek for the exercise, something Captain Harrison probably thought would highlight the difference between them. What he didn't expect was how much Sarah's jiu-jitsu training had prepared her for exactly this type of pressure. Engine failure on final approach, the instructor announced, triggering the beginning of the emergency scenario. You have smoke in the cockpit and your primary navigation system just went offline. Derek, who was serving as pilot in command for this scenario, immediately began rushing through checklists, his voice rising with stress as multiple warning lights illuminated the simulator cockpit. Okay, engine failure checklist. Where's the... Sarah, what's our altitude? 2,000 feet, rate of descent steady at 500 feet per minute. Sarah replied calmly. We have visual contact with the runway. Distance to threshold is 3 miles. Right, okay. Derek's hands were shaking slightly as he tried to manage multiple system failures simultaneously. The smoke, I need to... Where's the smoke elimination checklist? It's handled, Sarah said quietly. I've already activated the emergency air system and isolated the electrical system that was causing the smoke. We have clean air now. Derek looked at her with surprise. While he had been panicking about the engine failure, Sarah had been systematically working through the other emergency procedures without being asked. More importantly, she was doing it with the same calm composure she had learned to maintain when someone twice her size was trying to choke her unconscious. Altitude now 1,800 feet, she continued. I've already contacted Tower and declared an emergency. They've cleared all traffic and have fire trucks standing by. Do you want me to configure the aircraft for emergency landing? Derek nodded, still struggling to keep up with the pace of the emergency. Sarah's hands moved efficiently across the controls, setting flaps and gear configurations while simultaneously monitoring engine parameters and backup systems. 1,000 feet, she announced. All emergency checklists completed. Aircraft is configured for single-engine landing. Rate of descent is stable. The landing was textbook perfect. Derek managed the final approach and touchdown, but everyone in the simulation room knew that Sarah had been the one managing the emergency. She had demonstrated exactly the kind of calm decision-making under pressure that separated good pilots from great ones. Captain Harrison said nothing immediately after the exercise, but Sarah caught him reviewing the simulator data with other instructors. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see them pointing at various data points and nodding appreciatively. Derek's reaction was less positive. You should have told me you were doing those other checklists, he said after they exited the simulator. I'm supposed to be pilot in command. You can't just take over without communicating. Sarah looked at him steadily. I did communicate. I told you exactly what I was doing and when. You were too stressed to process it. I wasn't stressed. I was handling multiple emergencies simultaneously. That's what good pilots do. Good pilots stay calm and prioritize correctly, Sarah replied. They don't panic and miss half the emergency procedures. It was the first time she had directly challenged Derek, and he didn't like it. Neither did Brad Thompson, who had been watching the exchange. Getting a little mouthy, aren't you, Chen? Brad said. Just because you got lucky in one simulation doesn't mean you're suddenly better than everyone else. Sarah felt the familiar burn of anger in her chest, but her jiu-jitsu training had taught her to recognize and control that emotion. Instead of responding with heat, she responded with ice-cold clarity. I wasn't lucky. I was prepared. There's a difference. That evening at jiu-jitsu practice, Sarah rolled with unusual intensity. Her training partners noticed the difference immediately. Someone's got fire tonight, said James, a brown belt who regularly helped Sarah work on her technique. Everything okay? Sarah didn't answer directly, but she attacked every position with renewed focus. When James tried to pass her guard, she swept him. When he tried to secure side control, she escaped to a dominant position. When he tried to submit her, she countered and nearly submitted him instead. Damn, James said after their round ended. You've been holding out on us. Where'd that come from? I'm tired of people thinking they can push me around, Sarah said simply. Maria had been watching from across the room, and she approached Sarah after training ended. Want to talk about what happened today? Sarah described the simulation exercise, Derek's attitude afterward, and the growing tension between her and several of her classmates. She also talked about how the same people who questioned her abilities in flight school would probably never survive 5 minutes on a jiu-jitsu mat. There's actually a way to test that theory, Maria said thoughtfully. Our gym does self-defense workshops for different groups, corporate teams, women's groups, that kind of thing.
What if we offered to do one for your flight school class?
Sarah felt a spark of interest. You think they'd go for it? Most people think they can handle themselves physically until they actually try grappling with someone who knows what they're doing.
It's humbling. And sometimes people need to be humbled. The idea sat with Sarah for several days. The more she thought about it, the more appealing it became. Not because she wanted to embarrass Derek and Brad, though she certainly wouldn't mind that, but because she was tired of being seen as weak. She was tired of people questioning whether she belonged in aviation based on their assumptions about her physical capabilities. The opportunity came the following week when Captain Harrison announced that the class would be doing team-building exercises to improve cooperation and communication. Sir, Sarah said after the briefing, I train at a local martial arts gym that offers team-building workshops. They focus on pressure management, remaining calm in physical confrontations, and learning to work together under stress. Would that be something the class might be interested in? Captain Harrison considered the proposal. What kind of martial arts? Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's a grappling art that emphasizes technique over strength. Very applicable to aviation because it teaches you to think clearly when someone is trying to overwhelm you. Interesting. Let me think about it. 2 days later, Captain Harrison announced that the class would be participating in a self-defense workshop at Sarah's gym. The response from her classmates was predictable. This should be fun, Derek said with a grin. I wrestled in high school and did some boxing in the military. Should be interesting to see how your little martial arts class handles some real athletes. Brad nodded in agreement. Yeah, I've always wanted to try that UFC stuff. How hard could it be? Sarah said nothing, but she smiled for the first time in weeks. She had a feeling they were about to find out exactly how hard it could be. That evening, she called Maria to confirm the details. Just so I understand, Maria said, some of these are the same people who've been giving you trouble? Derek and Brad especially. They think physical strength is everything. Well, Maria said, they're about to get a very expensive education, and the tuition is going to be paid in humility. The morning of the team-building workshop, Sarah arrived at the gym early to help Maria and the other instructors prepare. The familiar smell of the mats and the sight of the training equipment filled her with a confidence she rarely felt at flight school. This was her territory now, and for the first time since starting the aviation program, she would be on equal footing with her classmates. You nervous? Maria asked as they set up water stations and arranged the training mats.
No.
Sarah said, and she was surprised to realize she meant it. I'm excited. The flight school students began arriving shortly after noon. Sarah watched Derek and Brad swagger through the door with the casual confidence of people who had never been truly challenged physically. They were followed by the rest of the class, most of whom looked curious but somewhat apprehensive about what they were about to experience. Captain Harrison arrived last, surveying the gym with the analytical eye of someone who had spent his career assessing new environments for potential threats and opportunities.
Welcome to Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, Maria announced to the group. Today we're going to explore how martial arts principles apply to stress management, decision-making under pressure, and teamwork.
But first, let me introduce you to the concept that makes jiu-jitsu different from other fighting sports. She gestured to James, the brown belt who often helped Sarah with her training. James was about Derek's size but moved with the fluid economy of motion that came from years of grappling experience. The fundamental principle of jiu-jitsu is that a smaller, weaker person can defeat a larger, stronger person through the application of proper technique, leverage, and timing.
Most people find this hard to believe until they experience it firsthand. Derek raised his hand. With respect, ma'am, I think size and strength matter a lot more than people want to admit.
I mean, there's a reason professional sports have weight classes. Maria smiled. You're absolutely right that size and strength matter,
but technique and experience matter more. Would you like to test that theory?
Sure,
Derek said, stepping forward with the confidence of someone who had never been submitted. What do I need to do? Just try to keep James from choking you unconscious. You can use any method you want. Strength, speed, whatever comes naturally to you. James will only use jiu-jitsu technique. The rest of the class gathered around as Derek and James faced each other on the mat. Derek immediately tried to use his size advantage, lunging forward to grab James around the waist. What happened next was a lesson in physics that no amount of classroom instruction could have provided. James stepped slightly to the side, used Derek's forward momentum against him, and within 3 seconds had Derek on his back with an arm wrapped around his throat. Derek's face began to turn red as he struggled frantically to escape, using every ounce of his considerable strength to try to break free from the choke.
Tap the mat when you want me to stop, James said calmly. Don't pass out.
Derek held out for another 10 seconds before slapping the mat repeatedly. James immediately released the choke and helped Derek back to his feet.
How?
Derek gasped, touching his throat and looking genuinely confused.
I'm stronger than you. I should have been able to overpower you. Strength without technique is just wasted energy, James explained.
You used all your power trying to push away from the choke, but you were pushing in the wrong direction.
If you had turned the right way or controlled my grip differently, your strength would have been enough to escape. Derek nodded slowly, but Sarah could see in his eyes that something fundamental had just shifted. For the first time in his life, he had encountered a situation where being bigger and stronger wasn't enough. Brad stepped up next, having watched Derek's experience with obvious skepticism.
I think Derek just wasn't ready for it. Can I try? The result was even more dramatic.
Brad tried to tackle James to the ground, thinking he could use his wrestling background to control the grappling exchange. Instead, James used Brad's momentum to throw him, landed in a dominant position, and submitted him with an arm lock in less than 20 seconds.
This is impossible, Brad said as he stood up, flexing his shoulder where the submission had been applied.
How are you doing this?
10 years of training, James replied simply. Your wrestling background actually helps you in some ways, but it also gives you bad habits for this kind of grappling. In wrestling, you're trying to pin someone's shoulders to the mat. In jiu-jitsu, we're trying to cut off blood flow to your brain or hyperextend your joints until you surrender. The rest of the class watched these demonstrations with growing respect for both the art of jiu-jitsu and for Sarah, who they were now realizing had been training in this incredibly demanding discipline while simultaneously excelling in their flight program.
All right, Maria announced. Now everyone gets to try. We're going to break into pairs and practice some basic positions.
The goal isn't to hurt anyone, it's to understand how positioning, leverage, and pressure work in a controlled environment. Sarah found herself paired with Jessica Williams, the pilot's daughter who had never shown her much interest at flight school.
As they worked through the basic techniques Maria was demonstrating, Jessica was clearly impressed with Sarah's skill level.
How long have you been doing this?
Jessica asked as Sarah helped her practice escaping from a basic hold.
About 4 months, Sarah replied, adjusting Jessica's grip on her uniform to make the technique more effective.
4 months? You move like you've been doing this for years.
I train 6 days a week, and I have good teachers. As the workshop progressed, something interesting began happening. The flight school students started asking Sarah for help with the techniques they were learning. Even Derek, still somewhat shaken from his earlier experience with James, approached her for advice on how to escape from certain positions.
I can't believe you've been doing this the whole time we've been giving you grief about being too small,
he said quietly, while Maria was demonstrating a technique to another group.
This stuff is incredibly difficult.
It is difficult, Sarah agreed. But that's what makes it worthwhile.
Easy things don't teach you much about yourself. The comment hung in the air between them, and Sarah could see Derek processing the implications. He was beginning to understand that while he had been questioning her physical capabilities, she had been developing skills that he couldn't even comprehend. The workshop continued with increasingly complex exercises designed to simulate stress and pressure. Students had to solve problems while being grappled, communicate with partners while defending themselves, and maintain composure in physically uncomfortable positions. These were exactly the kinds of challenges that aviation could present, but in a much more immediate and visceral way. Captain Harrison, who had been observing quietly for most of the session, finally stepped onto the mat. "Ms. Chen," he said, "would you mind demonstrating some of these techniques with me?" The gym fell silent. Captain Harrison was a former military pilot, still in excellent physical condition, and significantly larger than Sarah. This wasn't just a demonstration anymore, it was a test. "Of course, sir," Sarah replied, moving to the center of the mat. "I want to understand this leverage principle you've all been talking about," Captain Harrison said. "Show me how someone your size could control someone my size." Sarah looked at Maria, who nodded encouragingly. This was the moment she had been training for, not just in jiu-jitsu but in every aspect of her life. This was her chance to prove that she belonged, not just in aviation, but anywhere she chose to be. "Sir, I'm going to put you in what we call guard position," Sarah explained as she lay on her back and wrapped her legs around Captain Harrison's waist. "From here, even though you're on top and I'm on bottom, I actually have more control than you do." Captain Harrison immediately tried to use his strength to break free from Sarah's leg control, exactly as she had expected he would. Instead of fighting his pressure, she redirected it using his forward momentum to off-balance him and sweep him over her head. In one fluid motion, she had reversed their positions and was now on top. "How did that happen?" Captain Harrison asked, looking genuinely puzzled. "You pushed forward with your upper body, which lifted your hips and shifted your weight. I used that momentum to help you go in the direction you were already moving, just a little further than you wanted to go." "Show me that again." They repeated the technique several times, with Sarah explaining each step of the process. Captain Harrison was an excellent student, asking intelligent questions about timing, leverage, and weight distribution. More importantly, he was treating Sarah as the expert she had become, asking for her advice and deferring to her knowledge. The other students watched this exchange with fascination. They were seeing their instructor, a man they respected and, in some cases, feared, being taught by the same person they had been dismissing as too small and weak to be a serious pilot. "This is remarkable," Captain Harrison said after practicing the technique several more times. "The applications to aviation stress management are obvious." Chen, how has this training affected your performance in flight school?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "It's taught me that pressure and stress are just information, not emergencies. When someone is trying to choke you or break your arm, but you stay calm and think clearly, you can usually find a way out. Emergency procedures in aircraft are much less stressful than that." Captain Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "I can see how that would be valuable." The pilots who struggle most are usually the ones who panic under pressure, not the ones who lack technical knowledge. The workshop continued for another hour, with students practicing increasingly complex scenarios that combined physical challenges with problem-solving requirements. By the end of the session, every single person in the flight school class had been submitted multiple times by various jiu-jitsu practitioners, including Sarah. But the real revelation came during the final exercise of the day. Maria announced that they would end with one-on-one matches between volunteers from each group. Several flight school students immediately volunteered, clearly wanting to test their newly acquired skills against someone closer to their experience level. Derek was the first to step forward, and he looked directly at Sarah. "I'd like to try this with you, if that's okay." "I want to see how much I can apply what I learned today." Sarah felt every eye in the room focus on her. This was the moment she had been working toward since that first day in flight school, when Derek had suggested she was in the wrong place. This was her opportunity to definitively answer the question of whether she belonged. "Let's do it," she said simply. As they faced each other on the mat, Sarah felt a calm settle over her that was deeper than anything she had experienced in jiu-jitsu training. This wasn't about revenge or proving a point. This was about demonstrating the truth that Maria had taught her on her very first day. Leverage and technique could overcome size and strength. Derek had learned a few things during the workshop, but Sarah had learned everything. and she was about to show him the difference. The gymnasium fell completely silent as Sarah and Derek faced each other on the mat.
Even the sounds of traffic from the street outside seemed to fade away as everyone present understood they were about to witness something significant. This wasn't just a training exercise anymore. It was the culmination of months of tension, doubt, and unspoken challenges. Derek had learned enough during the workshop to be dangerous, but not enough to understand how dangerous Sarah had become. He approached her with newfound respect, but also with the lingering confidence of someone who still believed that physical advantages would ultimately prevail. "Remember," Maria called out to both of them, "this is about learning, not winning. Tap early, tap often, and don't let pride keep you from protecting yourselves." Sarah nodded, but her eyes never left Derek's. She had entered a mental state that her months of training had cultivated, completely calm, utterly focused, and ready to respond to whatever came next. The nervous energy that used to consume her during confrontations at flight school was gone, replaced by the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of. Derek made the first move, attempting to grab Sarah around the waist just as he had done with James earlier. But Sarah wasn't James, and she wasn't going to give Derek the same learning experience that James had provided. She had been watching Derek's tendencies all day, noting how he relied on his upper body strength and how he telegraphed his intentions with subtle weight shifts. Instead of avoiding Derek's attack, Sarah stepped into it, controlling his grip on her uniform, while simultaneously off-balancing him with a foot sweep that sent him tumbling to the mat. She followed him down, immediately establishing a dominant position that her training partners at the gym would have recognized instantly. Derek tried to use his strength to push Sarah away, exactly as she had expected. Every roll, every training session, every time she had been crushed by bigger, stronger opponents had taught her to anticipate this response. She allowed Derek to push, using his effort to advance to an even more dominant position. "Relax," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite the physical exertion. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Derek paused, confused by her calm demeanor. In that moment of hesitation, Sarah transitioned to the submission she had been setting up since the moment they had engaged. Her arms snaked around Derek's neck, locking in the same type of choke that James had used on him earlier, but with the refined precision of someone who had practiced this technique thousands of times. Derek's eyes went wide as he realized what was happening. He tried to grab Sarah's arm to pull it away from his throat, but her grip was positioned perfectly to prevent that escape. He tried to turn away from the pressure, but Sarah had already controlled his posture in a way that made turning impossible. For the first time in his adult life, Derek Martinez found himself in a position where his size, strength, and athletic background were completely irrelevant. No amount of muscle could break a properly applied choke when the person applying it understood leverage better than the person defending against it. The blood flow to Derek's brain began to slow as Sarah tightened her grip with surgical precision. She could feel his pulse against her forearm, could sense the exact moment when his struggles began to weaken. This was the moment when many people panicked, when the primitive part of their brain took over and made them thrash desperately against an escape that wasn't going to come through force. Derek held out longer than Sarah had expected, his pride keeping him from submitting even as his vision began to tunnel. But there was no escaping the fundamental physics of the position. Eventually, his hand began slapping frantically against the mat, the universal signal of surrender. Sarah released the choke immediately and helped Derek sit up, staying close to make sure he was recovering properly. Derek sat there for several moments, touching his throat and looking at Sarah with something approaching awe. "How?" he asked, his voice slightly hoarse. "I mean, I understand the technique, but how did you make it so inevitable? From the moment we started, it felt like you were controlling everything that happened." 4 months of getting choked unconscious by people who are better than me," Sarah replied with a small smile. "You learn to see several moves ahead when your survival depends on it." Captain Harrison approached the mat, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Chen, that was impressive. Not just the physical technique, but the mental composure. You never seemed rushed or stressed, even when managing a much larger opponent. Thank you, sir. Jiu-Jitsu teaches you that panic is the enemy. When you can stay calm and think clearly, you usually have more options than you realize." Derek stood up slowly, still processing what had just happened. "I owe you an apology," he said, loud enough for the entire class to hear. "I've been questioning whether you belong in flight school based on assumptions that I now realize were completely wrong. If you can do this," he gestured to the mat where he had just been submitted, "then you can handle anything aviation throws at you." It was the first time Derek had publicly acknowledged Sarah's capabilities, and the effect on the rest of the class was immediate and visible.
Students who had been treating her as an outsider began looking at her with genuine respect. Even Brad Thompson, who had been one of her harshest critics, approached her with a request to learn some of the techniques she had demonstrated. But the real validation came from an unexpected source. As the class was preparing to leave, Captain Harrison asked Sarah to stay behind for a private conversation. "Miss Chen," he began once they were alone, "I want to apologize for my own preconceptions about your capabilities. I've been evaluating your performance based on outdated criteria that don't reflect the realities of modern aviation." Sarah remained silent, unsure where this conversation was headed. "The truth is," Captain Harrison continued, "your academic performance has been outstanding from day one. Your situational awareness is better than most students I've taught, and your ability to remain calm under pressure, which I witnessed both in the simulator and here today, is exactly what we need in commercial pilots." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I've been so focused on physical benchmarks that I lost sight of what really matters: judgment, composure, and the ability to think clearly when everything is going wrong. You've demonstrated all of those qualities consistently." "Thank you, sir," Sarah replied. "I just want to be the best pilot I can be. I have no doubt that you will be. In fact, I'd like to recommend you for the accelerated training track. It's designed for students who show exceptional aptitude and leadership potential." Sarah felt her breath catch. The accelerated track was the fast lane to commercial aviation, reserved for the top 5% of students. It would mean additional responsibilities, more challenging assignments, and closer scrutiny, but it would also mean finishing the program 6 months earlier and with the kind of credentials that airlines noticed. "I would be honored, sir," she managed to say. Captain Harrison smiled. "The honor is mine, Ms. Chen. I have a feeling you're going to make us all very proud." As Sarah walked back to her apartment that evening, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just a few months. The girl who had started flight school feeling like an outsider was now being fast-tracked for success. The student who had been questioned and doubted was now teaching her classmates about pressure management and mental toughness. But the most significant change wasn't in how others saw her, it was in how she saw herself. She was no longer the small girl trying to prove she belonged. She was a pilot in training, a martial artist, and someone who had learned to find opportunity in every challenge. The next day at flight school, the atmosphere was completely different. Derek not only stopped making disparaging comments about Sarah's capabilities, but began actively supporting her in group exercises. Jessica Williams invited her to join the study group that had previously excluded her. Even the instructors seemed to view her through a different lens, asking for her input during briefings and recognizing her contributions to class discussions. More importantly, Sarah began to notice changes in her own performance. The confidence she had gained on the jiu-jitsu mats translated directly to her work in flight simulators and aircraft. Emergency procedures that had once felt overwhelming now seemed manageable. Pressure situations that used to create stress now felt like puzzles to be solved. During a particularly challenging navigation exercise, Sarah found herself thinking in the same systematic, patient way that she approached grappling matches. Instead of rushing to complete tasks, she prioritized them based on safety and efficiency. Instead of letting time pressure create panic, she used it to maintain focus. The result was her best performance to date in any practical exercise. "Outstanding work, Chen," Captain Harrison announced after reviewing her exercise results. "That's the kind of decision-making we want to see from our commercial pilots." Sarah smiled, but inside she was thinking about her next jiu-jitsu class and the new techniques Maria had promised to teach her. She was also thinking about the conversation she had overheard between Derek and Brad after the workshop. "I can't believe I used to think she was weak," Derek had said. "She's probably tougher than any of us." "Definitely tougher than me," Brad had replied. "I wouldn't want to mess with her in a dark alley." Sarah had to suppress a laugh at that comment. If Brad only knew what she was really capable of now, or what she planned to become capable of in the coming months, he might think twice about challenging anyone who trained in martial arts. But there was still one more test waiting for her, one more opportunity to prove definitively that she belonged not just in aviation, but anywhere she chose to apply her skills. And this test was going to come from someone who had never been beaten, someone who made even the advanced students at her gym look like beginners. This test was going to come from her head instructor himself. 6 months after her first jiu-jitsu class, Sarah Chen was no longer the uncertain flight school student who had walked into the gym seeking confidence. She had transformed into something far more dangerous, a person who understood both her own capabilities and the extent to which those capabilities could be applied. Her progression in jiu-jitsu had been nothing short of remarkable, and even veteran practitioners were beginning to take notice. Professor Miguel Santos, the head instructor and owner of the gym,
was Maria's older brother and a fourth-degree black belt who had competed at the highest levels of the sport. He was known for his technical precision, his calm teaching demeanor, and the fact that in 15 years of running the gym, no student had ever submitted him during training. Not the brown belts, not the visiting black belts from other schools, and certainly not the blue belts like Sarah. "Your sister's been telling me interesting things about your progress," Professor Santos said to Sarah after a particularly intense training session. "She says you've been developing faster than anyone she's taught."
Sarah bowed respectfully.
Professor Santos commanded a level of reverence in the gym that bordered on religious. Students spoke in whispers about his competition victories, his technical innovations, and his ability to make elite grapplers look like children when he chose to demonstrate techniques. "I've had excellent teachers, Professor," Sarah replied, "and I train as much as my schedule allows." "How much is that exactly?" 6 days a week, sometimes twice a day when I don't have flight school obligations." Professor Santos nodded approvingly. Commitment is the difference between students who learn techniques and students who develop skills. But there's something else that separates good students from exceptional ones: the ability to perform under the highest levels of pressure. He gestured toward the center mat where advanced students were finishing their training rounds. "I'd like to test something, if you're willing." Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but her expression remained calm. "What kind of test, Professor? I want to see how your jiu-jitsu holds up against someone who outweighs you by 100 pounds, has 20 years more experience, and has never been submitted by a student. Are you interested in that kind of pressure?" The gym gradually fell silent as other students realized what Professor Santos was proposing. A role between a 6-month blue belt and a head instructor was unprecedented. Even advanced students rarely had the opportunity to grapple with Professor Santos during regular training sessions. Sarah looked around the gym and saw faces filled with curiosity, excitement, and concern. Maria caught her eye and gave an encouraging nod, but Sarah could see worry in her expression as well. This wasn't a casual training role, this was an examination of everything Sarah had learned, under conditions that would have broken most people. "Yes, Professor," Sarah said without hesitation. "I'm interested." As they stepped onto the mat, Professor Santos began explaining the rules to the watching students. "This is going to be a normal training role, but I want everyone to observe how pressure affects decision-making. Miss Chen has been developing excellent technique, but technique under stress is different from technique in isolation." Sarah knelt across from Professor Santos and felt a calm settle over her that she recognized from her most challenging training sessions. This was the mental state she had cultivated through months of being dominated by larger, stronger, more experienced opponents. This was the composure she had learned to access when survival depended on thinking clearly despite overwhelming pressure. They touched hands and began. Professor Santos immediately established a grip on Sarah's uniform and began advancing with the smooth, relentless pressure that characterized his teaching style. He wasn't trying to crush her or demonstrate his superiority. He was testing her responses to progressively increasing challenges. Sarah recognized the familiar pattern of being pressured by a superior opponent and responded the way her training had taught her. Instead of fighting directly against Professor Santos's pressure, she redirected it, using his forward momentum to off-balance him slightly and create space for her own techniques.
Professor Santos smiled almost imperceptibly as he felt Sarah's response.
This was exactly the type of jiu-jitsu that he taught, using an opponent's energy against them rather than trying to overpower them directly. For the first few minutes, the role looked like many training sessions between an instructor and an advanced student. Professor Santos would establish a dominant position, Sarah would work methodically to escape, and the cycle would repeat. But as the role continued, something unusual began happening. Sarah wasn't just defending anymore. She was beginning to create genuine offensive opportunities. The first time Sarah swept Professor Santos, landing him on his back and establishing top position, a murmur went through the watching students. Sweeping the professor during training was notable, but when Sarah immediately transitioned to a submission attempt, an armbar that Professor Santos had to defend seriously, the murmur became absolute silence. "Interesting," Professor Santos said as he escaped from the submission attempt and regained his guard. "Most students become defensive when they roll with me. You're still hunting for submissions." "You taught us to always be looking for opportunities," Sarah replied, resetting her grips and immediately beginning to pass his guard. Size and rank don't change the principles. What happened next would become legend in the gym's history. Sarah had been working on a specific guard pass that Maria had taught her, a technique that relied on precise timing and leverage rather than strength. As Professor Santos adjusted his position to defend against her pass, Sarah recognized the exact opportunity she had been looking for. She shifted her weight in a way that Professor Santos didn't expect, used his defensive movement against him, and passed his guard with such smoothness that it looked choreographed. Before Professor Santos could recover, Sarah had established side control and was already working toward the submission that she had been setting up since the beginning of the roll. Professor Santos found himself in a position he rarely experienced, being controlled by someone who understood leverage well enough to negate his size and experience advantages. Sarah's months of training with larger opponents had taught her exactly how to maintain control once she achieved it, and she applied that knowledge with surgical precision. The submission that followed was a masterpiece of technique and timing. Sarah controlled Professor Santos's arm and shoulder in a way that made his superior strength irrelevant, gradually increasing pressure until he had no choice but to acknowledge what was happening.
The tap came quietly, almost anticlimactically.
Professor Santos simply patted Sarah's leg twice, the universal signal of submission, and she immediately released the hold. The gym erupted in cheers, but Professor Santos raised his hand for silence. He and Sarah sat up on the mat, and he looked at her with an expression that mixed respect, surprise, and genuine pride. "In 15 years of teaching," he said to the assembled students, "I have never been submitted by anyone below the rank of brown belt. Today, that record ended." He turned to Sarah. "But more importantly, you demonstrated something that no rank or medal can teach. The courage to compete at your highest level, regardless of the opponent or the circumstances. That's not just good jiu-jitsu, that's good character." Sarah bowed deeply, understanding that something significant had just occurred. She had not just submitted her instructor, she had proven to herself and everyone present that there were no limits to what she could achieve if she was willing to commit completely to the process of improvement. The story of Sarah's submission spread quickly through the local martial arts community and eventually reached her flight school classmates. Derek, who had become one of her strongest supporters, was the first to congratulate her. "I heard about what happened at your gym," he said during a break between classes. "I can't even imagine the pressure of grappling with someone at that level. How did you stay calm?" "The same way I stay calm during emergency procedures," Sarah replied. "I trust my training and focus on what I can control." Captain Harrison, who had been tracking Sarah's progress closely since the accelerated program recommendation, pulled her aside after her final check ride. "Miss Chen," he said, "I've been in aviation for 25 years, and I've learned to recognize certain qualities in pilots who go on to have exceptional careers. You have those qualities in abundance." Sarah had passed every phase of her training with distinction, finishing at the top of her class and earning recommendations that would open doors at any airline in the country. But more than that, she had transformed herself from someone who doubted her place in aviation into someone who could excel in any challenging environment. 3 months later, Sarah received her commercial pilot's license and her first job offer from a major airline. On her last day at the flight school, Captain Harrison presented her with an award that had never been given to a first-year student, the Outstanding Performance Under Pressure recognition. "This award," he explained to the assembled class, "goes to students who demonstrate exceptional composure and decision-making ability under the most challenging circumstances. Ms. Chen has shown us all what it means to remain calm, think clearly, and execute perfectly when everything is on the line." Derek, who had also graduated successfully and would be starting with a regional airline, approached Sarah after the ceremony. "I learned more about aviation from watching you handle pressure than I did from any textbook or simulator," he said. "But I also learned something about myself, about how wrong I can be when I judge people based on assumptions instead of evidence." Sarah smiled, thinking about how much had changed since that first day when Derek had suggested she was in the wrong place. Now he was asking for her advice on handling the stress of airline training, and she was happy to share what she had learned. But the most meaningful conversation came from Captain Harrison, who asked to speak with her privately before she left. "Ms. Chen," he said, "I want you to know that you've changed how I evaluate students. I used to focus primarily on physical capabilities and traditional markers of pilot aptitude. Watching your development has taught me that the most important qualities, composure under pressure, continuous learning, and the determination to exceed expectations, often come from sources I never considered." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "You came into this program as an outsider and transformed not just yourself but everyone around you. That's not just good piloting, that's leadership. I have no doubt that you'll go on to captain aircraft and inspire other people who think they don't belong in aviation." As Sarah cleaned out her locker and prepared to leave flight school for the final time, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment.
The girl who had been laughed at and dismissed had become the pilot who graduated at the top of her class. The student who had been questioned and doubted had become the person her classmates looked to for guidance under pressure. But perhaps most importantly, the person who had once defined herself by other people's limitations had learned to define herself by her own possibilities. Every challenge that had seemed impossible had become merely difficult. Every person who had doubted her capabilities had become irrelevant to her self-definition. That evening, Sarah went to the gym for one final training session before moving to begin her airline career. Professor Santos approached her as she was leaving. "I have something for you," he said, holding out a black belt with her name embroidered in gold letters. Sarah stared at the belt in confusion. "Professor, I'm only a blue belt. I haven't earned this." Professor Santos smiled. "This belt isn't for your current rank, it's for your future rank. I'm giving it to you because I know that no matter where your aviation career takes you, you'll continue training and growing in Jiu-Jitsu. When you do earn this belt, and you will, I want you to remember the lesson you taught all of us." "What lesson is that, Professor?" "That there's no limit to what someone can achieve when they refuse to accept other people's definitions of what's possible. You didn't just submit me on that mat, you submitted every assumption that said a small person couldn't succeed in a big person's world." Sarah accepted the belt with deep gratitude, understanding that it represented much more than future achievement in martial arts. It represented the principle that had transformed every aspect of her life. The belief that technique, persistence, and courage could overcome any limitation that others tried to impose. Years later, as Captain Sarah Chen commanded commercial flights around the world, she would keep that black belt in her flight bag as a reminder of what she had learned in a small gym in Arizona. She had discovered that the same principles that allowed a small person to submit a larger opponent could allow anyone to exceed the expectations that society placed on them. The girl who had been laughed at in flight school had indeed made the jiu-jitsu instructor tap out. But more than that, she had made an entire industry tap out to the idea that aviation belonged only to people who fit a traditional mold. She had proven that belonging wasn't something that others granted you. It was something you earned through the quiet accumulation of skills, the patient development of character, and the courage to compete at your highest level regardless of the odds. And she had done it all without ever raising her voice, without ever responding to insults with anger, and without ever compromising the principles that had made her success possible. In the end, that was the most impressive submission of all.